We are having an outside program tonight due to a few technical difficulties. We can't get in the building. But it's going to be nice, and thanks to some volunteers, we have managed to get that up. So we're very pleased tonight to have Caelan, Caelan Libke as our speaker. Caelan was born in Japan, but moved to Canada as a child and grew up at Melfort. Like many children, he had a passion for dinosaurs. Unlike most of them, he kept that passion going and decided to get into paleontology for a career. He obtained a bachelor's degree at the University of Alberta and then came here to the University of Regina, where he's currently in the second year of his master's program. And as many of us know, but we'll know better after, Saskatchewan has a pretty rich fossil record. Dinosaurs, ancient turtles, plants, many other creatures. Caelan's master's research focuses on, I understand, using new techniques to study various topics in paleontology. He was just telling me that he's in the process of publishing the different chapters of his thesis as paper in scientific journals. So he's in the publishing stage of his master's research. And tonight he's going to tell us about some of the work he and others are doing and about some of the ancient fauna of the province. And so over to you, Caelan, and thank you very much. And thank you very much for adapting to our rather unusual situation.
No problem at all.
Welcome, Dan.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm just gonna make myself comfortable here, and then so yeah, today's talk is probably going to be a little bit different than what you're used to. So we're not going to be talking about things that are still living, but things that are dead. And so you probably didn't know, or you might have known, but Saskatchewan is really rich in fossils, and not many people know that because Alberta is always, the top dog for fossils. But today I want to highlight some of the cool things that are coming out of Saskatchewan and some of the cool research that's going on here. So there was already a bit of an introduction, but like he said, I went through a dinosaur stage when I was about 3, which is the picture there, and never grew out of it. So ever since then, I've been working on becoming a paleontologist, and this is just kind of my passion. So I hope that I can share that with you today, and you come to appreciate some of the cool paleontology stuff going on here in this province. So before we get into the thick of it, I kind of want to set the basis of today's talk. And so on the bottom there, you'll see that is the geological time scale. So all the numbers at the bottom, that is in millions of years. And on the right there, that is a map of Saskatchewan with the rocks that are the bedrock of Saskatchewan. So you'll see it's a lot of colors, but I'll explain it. And so Saskatchewan, we're lucky that we preserve rocks from all 3 of the main eras of time. So there's the Cenozoic, which is yellow on the geologic time scale. That's kind of the age of mammals. We have the Mesozoic, which is kind of the blue there. That's the age of the dinosaurs. And then everything before that is known as the Paleozoic. So we actually have rocks from what's known as the Silurian and Devonian period. And if you look on the map there, it's that little blue circle. So little bits of rock kind of around Flin Flon and Deschambault Lake. There's little bits of limestone outcrops where we can find fossils from this time period. And you can see that's about 450 to 350 million years ago, which is just a mind-boggling amount of time. And then we kind of skip forward in our rock record. And next we have rocks from the late Cretaceous period. So about 90 to 66 million years ago. This is squarely at the end of the age of the dinosaurs. And pretty much all of southern Saskatchewan, all of that green on that map, that's rocks where you can find things like dinosaurs. And then finally, we also have some rocks from the Cenozoic era. So this is the age of the mammals after the dinosaurs go extinct. And so most of our rocks from that time is from the Eocene epoch. So it's a specific period of time, about 50 to 40 million years ago. And all of those rocks are mostly outcropping in southern Saskatchewan in the yellow there. So areas around the border, but also near East End. So we're going to go take a trip back in time, and we're going to kind of visit all of these little chapters in the Book of Time. So Back in the Devonian, this is the age of fishes. So this is one of the earliest times in Saskatchewan where we can find fossils. And so this time, Earth looked much different than what it is now. So vascular plants had just begun forming forests. So if you landed on Earth back in that time, you probably would have thought it was an alien planet. And at that time, it's known as the age of fishes because fishes began diversifying in the oceans. And by the end of the Devonian, some of them had started taking onto land. So this is right when vertebrates start to go onto land. And so the Silurian and Devonian in Saskatchewan was quite different from the environment we have now. So again, it's about 300 or 450 to 350 million years ago. And if you look at the map of the Earth there, you probably can't even recognize any of the continents that we have now. But if you look here, Saskatchewan was actually south of the equator, and we would have been this shallow equatorial sea. And so during this time, we have a lot of animals that lived in the ocean, and we actually catch some of that in the fossil record. And these are all fossils I found in the limestone, kind of in the Deschambault Lake area. So we have things like corals. So that's a fossil of a coral, and ammonites, which are, if you're not familiar, it's kind of like a squid head with a snail's body almost. It's got these round shells, and they actually were so successful, they survived into the time when the dinosaurs were around. And finally, you'll see there's these little specks in that, and you're probably thinking, what the heck is that? It's just little flecks of nothing. But those ones circled there are actually stalks of these what are called crinoids, so commonly called sea lilies. And so these are relatives to things like sea urchins and sea stars, but it's pretty much a sea star on a stalk. And the stalk are made up of these little columnals, they're called. They're kind of like coins in a stack. And once they die, they fall apart. And so you can imagine that was once a seafloor where there were crinoids, and then eventually it fell apart and got preserved. So this period of time, there's not too many outcrops. So we don't really know too much about that from Saskatchewan, but hopefully someday someone picks up these fossils and starts researching them. And then we make a jump about 300 million years into the future from the Devonian, and we're into the Cretaceous, which is the age of dinosaurs. But this was a period of sea transgression and regression. So the sea level was rising and falling, and at certain times, Saskatchewan was actually underwater. So no dinosaurs in the water. Instead, we had these massive marine reptiles. These are called mosasaurs and plesiosaurs. We also had massive sea turtles and things that almost look like penguins, these primitive birds. But as time went on, this was about 90 million years ago. If we skip forward a little bit, the sea levels change, and eventually we get to a point where the little interior seaway in the middle of North America recedes on both sides. And that's when we get rocks from when the dinosaurs were around. And so we get, or in Saskatchewan in the late Cretaceous, during that time, it would have been the average annual temperature of about 12 to 14 degrees Celsius compared to the measly 4 degrees that we have now. And so this area would have been kind of subtropical in climate with things like swamps and meandering rivers. And a good modern reference point for that would be something like the Florida Everglades. And so you can see this is a picture of the Florida Everglades. Everything here, except for maybe the grass, because the grass didn't evolve until after the dinosaurs went extinct. So those would have been replaced by things like cycads and ferns. But overall, if you imagine the Cretaceous in Saskatchewan, think this almost beachfront property in the Florida Everglades. That's kind of what you get in Saskatchewan.
I got her out.
And so some of the cool fossils we get fossils from both the ocean and the land. So we're lucky that we can study both sides of the coin. And so in the ocean, we had these massive marine reptiles. So you can see this one on the left here is a long-necked plesiosaur. This specimen was found in Pontiac, Saskatchewan. And the weird thing is these guys are about 9 meters long and about 6 meters of them are neck. So they have these really, really long necks, and they look actually really funny because they just look so unruly with those weird necks. In Pontiac, Saskatchewan. Yep. And then other animals, there were these other massive marine reptiles, like the tylosaur on the right, and then the
park
and you can see they're similar in shape, but also slightly different. And those were because they were filling different niches in the ecosystem. And that middle one, the prognathodon, we actually found most of the jaw last year when we were out in Grasslands National Park. So lots of cool things are still coming out of the rock. And of course, there's also dinosaurs, which I love, and I'm sure a lot of you guys love too. And so you get the classic Cretaceous dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus Rex, and we have the biggest T-Rex in the world, along with Triceratops and Edmontosaurus. So these are kind of the big three of the Cretaceous, and these were all the largest of their kind. So the dinosaurs were at the top of their game right before the extinction. But you have to remember, there are other animals within the ecosystem as well. So there's things like smaller dinosaurs, fishes like gars. So gars are still around in more southern areas, but they were up in Saskatchewan. And there's diamond-shaped things in the top right. Those are gar scales. And that's probably one of the most common fossils you find in Saskatchewan. Other things include crocodiles and what are known as champsosaurs, which are these crocodile-looking animals. Things like turtles, salamanders, and frogs. Turtle shells are also one of the more common fossils you find. Mammals. So this little jaw, we found this year, and so it would have belonged to one of our ancestors way back, probably scuttling under the feet of dinosaurs. And there's also birds, primitive birds, and this one they have it drawn almost like a duck, but of course, all good things must come to an end. And one fateful day, an asteroid impacted the Yucatan Peninsula around the Gulf of Mexico, and that was the end for the dinosaurs. So you can imagine a massive asteroid hit the Earth, and just a crazy amount of fallout happened, and Earth probably was pretty dark for hundreds of years possibly. And Saskatchewan's cool because you can actually see the extinction line, as we call it. And this is actually the ash from the fallout of the impact. And you can find this layer all across the world, but in Saskatchewan, you can actually see it. Most of the times it's either obscured or lost, but you can see, this is actually from Grasslands National Park. This is a place in the world where you can touch the line and say, this is when the dinosaurs died. And there's no dinosaurs above that have been ever found anywhere in the world. This is the East Block. Yeah, East Block is, so it's kind of cool. East Block has all the terrestrial animals, and the West Block has all the marine animals, which is a little bit further back in time.
Is that layer pretty big for different areas in the world?
Yeah, so well, most of it's just a thin layer in most cases, yeah, but a thin ash layer, and you can actually find iridium in it. And so this iridium you can find all across the world. And if you're not familiar, iridium comes usually from extraterrestrial bodies. So probably came from that asteroid and then spread all across the world into this one layer. And then, of course, after the extinction, the age of mammals begin. And so the mammals diversify and start filling up all the niches that the dinosaurs had occupied for hundreds of millions of years. And iridium, you mean? Or any of these, they just they start filling in different niches as soon as something goes extinct. Yeah. And so in this case, we have rocks from the Eocene, which is a time there was this thing going on known as the Eocene thermal maximum. And this was when the Earth was at its hottest ever. And so the climate was much hotter and drier than the Cretaceous. So no more, Florida Everglades, and it became replaced by things like woodland savanna. And so you can see there are animals like, I'll hide this first. Animals like what are known as brontotheres, which are in exhibit. So if you ever have a chance, go through the museum. There's some cool stuff. And this is when things like the ancestors of horses would have originated. And we actually do have fossils from the Ice Age, but they're actually pretty rare. And we do occasionally have, the odd mammoth tusk. And when the Ice Age was occurring, but the glaciers had retreated, weird things like lions, cheetahs, and camels were alive in Saskatchewan at a certain point. But that brings us back to present. And right now, the current research focus for most of us at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum is in the Cretaceous period. So as I mentioned, we look at we go on expeditions to places like Grasslands National Park, which is these two here, Chambéry Coulee, which is the area around East End, where Scotty was found, and then the Big Muddy Badlands. So those are kind of the main areas that we usually investigate lately. So now that we've gone through and we've kind of set the basis for the geological history of Saskatchewan, I'd like to kind of talk a little bit more about the project that I'm working on and how some of the other projects that are going on in the Royal Saskatchewan Museum relate to it as well. So as Dale mentioned, my project, my thesis, goes under the overall theme of studying old fossils with new techniques. And so it's split up into 3 different subsections. And one is studying fossils in amber using the thing called a synchrotron, which I'll go into more detail later. Another project worked on laser scanning dinosaur skin to provide a better description of it. And then finally, I'm applying histological techniques to study dinosaur age. So we'll start with talking about fossils in amber. And some of you might think, well, what is amber? And so if you've watched Jurassic Park, you might be familiar. It's the thing that the mosquitoes stuck in, and they get the dinosaur DNA out of the mosquito. That doesn't work in real life, unfortunately, but that's where you might be familiar from to amber. And so amber is actually fossilized tree resin. So all the sap that comes out of trees, if it gets buried under the right circumstances, it may become amber someday. And there are well-known deposits around the world in Myanmar, in the Dominican Republic, and all around the Baltic Sea. And because sap is so sticky, occasionally it traps things from the environment, and these are called inclusions. And of course, you get things like plants and insects, but sometimes you get even weirder things like crabs and little baby birds, and even dinosaur tails stuck in amber. And all 3 of those cool things I just mentioned, my supervisor, Ryan McKellar at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, was part of the research team that worked on that. So there's a lot of cool amber research going on because of him in Saskatchewan. And so the amber that we get in Saskatchewan is collected from a place called Big Muddy. So if you're familiar with Castle Butte, it's right across the valley from Castle Butte. So it's found in the coal layer known as the Battle Formation. And the amber we get from there is not the jewelry grade that I just showed you. It's these little tiny millimeter-sized flecks, but you can occasionally find things inside the amber. So ever since the site was found, we've been collecting, and I've been participating in the collection as well. Since then, there's been thousands of pieces of amber that have been found. And so you can see what we do, we just go out for a day, sit on the side of a hill and pick amber with tweezers all day, and then come home and then do it again. You usually go out and, 2 or 3 days in a row. And it is cold and it's dark. So it feels like when it's hot outside, you're getting burnt from the sky, from the sun, and then the coal heats up and you feel like you're in an oven. But, all the inclusions, the stuff we find inside make it all worth it. So what we have to do is we have to manually sort and then embed and then screen them for inclusion. So all of those little black pieces are pieces of amber. We have to look at each and every one of them under a microscope to see if there's anything in them. And these are rare, but they're still there. We probably find occasionally one in about 100 to 500 pieces. So it is a very long process, but you can find insects preserved inside the amber from Saskatchewan. And so in most cases, these amber pieces are fragmentary, and so the insects inside are broken up as well. And sometimes they're even obscured by those cracks or something growing on the outside of it. So even if we have a good insect specimen in there, if we can't see it, we can't study it, then we can't describe it and publish on it. So what we do is use what's called the synchrotron. So the Canadian life source synchrotron is a particle accelerator, one of the only ones in Canada, and it's in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And so I'm gonna spare you all the physics jargon that goes into it because I barely understand it myself. But it essentially allows for very high resolution CT images of things like fossils and amber. So you can see here, this is me and my colleague Alyssa. We were scanning some amber, and you can see that right there is a little amber piece. So a lot of machinery to study one tiny little fleck of amber, but the light from the synchrotron comes through here, and by using the CT data, we can actually make 3D models of the specimens inside the amber. So you can see this one was a pretty good specimen already, but because we scanned it at the synchrotron, we can make a 3D model that you can rotate in any way, you can take pictures of, and enhance some certain details. So all of these are very useful in identifying new species and describing them. Right. So it takes quite a while actually. And we recently moved to a different beamline, so a little different method. But each amber piece, I think in the new method took about 20 to 30 minutes to scan. In the old method, it took probably a couple hours, 3 hours maybe. Yeah. So it is a pretty intense process, and we only get allotted like a 24-hour shift. So we go in there, we waste no time, just go 24 hours straight and come home and then pass out. But it's all worth it because you can get such nice specimens or 3D models from it. Exactly, right? Yeah. And so this is another specimen. So you can see it's not always the best preservation, even after the synchrotron. But compared to what you can see under the microscope, the 3D model is much better, and it allows us to pick up fine details that'll help us with the description. And another thing that we're recently working on is this ant specimen. And so this might be one of the oldest of its kind. And this is actually ongoing research at the moment. And we recently sent a picture of these to an ant specialist in the US, and we're hoping that they can get back to us with a good identification of the ant. But this is really cool because in the Cretaceous, ants were the modern groups of ants were just starting to diversify. So it'll be really important in understanding how they started to diversify and how the ant groups turned over time. And so we also work on other amber pieces from other areas of the world. So these specimens were worked on by other members of the lab, people like Alyssa that you saw earlier, but also international students from the UK and France. And they've been working on this one. So the student from the UK had been working on this one. So these are reproducing beetles from Dominican amber, which is about 20 to 50 million years ago. And you can tell that it was reproducing because it has its genital capsule out. So we think that it got blown into some amber while maybe they were mating or flying and mating. But it's really cool because amber can sometimes catch things like behaviors. Another thing, this is a new beetle species on the right, worked on by Victor, who's a student from France. And this is another example of how the use of the synchrotron can help us identify things that we couldn't even see beforehand. So you can see it was covered by all kind of this fuzz, but once you use the synchrotron, you can kind of shoot through that and look at the actual insect inside. So now we'll move on to the turtle fossil that we worked on. So this one was nicknamed Squirtle the Turtle after the Pokemon. And so it is a small kinosternid, which is a musk turtle. So you can see a picture of the kinosternid right there. And so this was a really tiny turtle, and it's the second complete kinosternid from North America. And so just to show you how small it is, that container that it's sitting in is one of those takeout dishes you get from Boston Pizza. So you can imagine the turtle's about the size of small peewee football. And you can see that part's the head, and that part's the shell. And from a frontal view, that's the shell. And you can see the skull is there, but you can't really see the fine details, and we couldn't prepare it anymore because the bones were so thin and fragile that it would have just gone broken up into dust. So what we did, we used the synchrotron, and you can see we get such a nice 3D model of the entire body, and it's things like the skull. And you can see this was really cool because things like the toe bones were still in there, and things like the tailbones. And we think it's probably about 90 to 95% complete. It's just missing a few of the feet. And with the synchrotron, you can really zoom in and look at some of the suture patterns in the skull. And with the help of a turtle specialist from the Royal Tyrrell Museum, we were able to determine that this was a new genus and species, brand new from Saskatchewan, and we named it Laeochelys tokeriki after Tim Tokarik, who's done a lot of paleontological research in Saskatchewan. And so another cool thing is that because it's a 3D model, we can make it transparent and look at things inside. So those tiny little lines there, those are some of the canals going from the brain case out to the outside of the skull. So things that we would not be able to look at becomes possible to study once you use the synchrotron. So just going to take a quick drink here. And that brings me to the end of the synchrotron part of the project. But now we'll talk about the project I worked on with laser scans to study dinosaur skin. And so you're probably thinking, dinosaur skin, what do you mean? I thought that just disintegrates and doesn't preserve in the fossil record. Well, so it's occasionally possible for it to be preserved, but it's very rare and doesn't happen very often, and can be preserved in as impressions just in the rock, compression, in which case the skin becomes a carbon film around the fossil. So you can see the black around the middle fossil there. That's where the skin used to be. And then it can also be permineralized, in which case the skin itself becomes replaced by minerals, and then it preserves kind of the 3D shape of the scales, as you can see on the right two specimens there. And oddly, things like the duck-billed dinosaurs have skin fossils associated with them pretty often. I don't want to say often, but more often than other dinosaurs. We're not quite sure why, and this is one of those mysteries of paleontology that we may never understand. But at the moment, we think it might be because they don't have any defensive structures, so they might have had tougher skin, and that might be it. So the specimen from Saskatchewan with skin on it is nicknamed Skinny because it has skin on it. And so this is a disarticulated skeleton. So the bones are pretty jumbled up with patches of skin fossils. And it's a subadult dinosaur called Edmontosaurus annectans, which is these massive duck-billed dinosaurs that roamed Saskatchewan 66 to 68 million years ago. And so you can see that is the quarry map on the top right there. So those bones there represent part of the forearm, and that part there represents part of the hip and kind of the thoracic area. And that right there is the skin in blue there. So we think that the skin patch came from somewhere around the hip of this dinosaur. So of course, Edmontosaurus skin impressions are actually one of the most well-studied of any dinosaur, and skin is known for most of the body. So you can see in this diagram here, all of the gray is areas we know for sure we have skin patches from. But largely, this is mostly due to these mummies of dinosaurs. So these really well-preserved specimens with skin that's still attached to their body. And you can see this one looks like it just dried up on the side of a river bank. And that's probably what happened to it, but eventually got covered. There's another specimen here. All of that right there is skin on, I think that's the tail there. So just big patches of skin, and that allows us to understand what kind of scales they have across their body. And so what I did with the skin fossil we have from Saskatchewan is we laser scanned it with just a desktop laser scanner. And this has two advantages. So one is that you can get really fine details. So this is a picture, and this is the 3D model we made from the scans. You can really see the fine details, sometimes better than pictures, and then you can enhance it by using different shadows and things like that. Another advantage is that by 3D scanning it, you have a 3D model that can be shared anywhere online. So we have a database that we've shared it to, and future researchers can just go and use that instead of having to come all the way to Saskatchewan or us having to mail the specimen to another country. And so this, I hope, facilitates further research into things like skin fossils, because right now there's not too much known about the skin fossils. So I also went to describe the scale fossils, since we have so much to compare it to. And it has the same general scale pattern to other specimens of the same species. So they have these clusters of these larger polygonal scales that are surrounded by smaller pebbly scales. And you can see the general pattern up here, and both skinny and other Edmontosaurus specimens show the same pattern. However, a weird thing I found was that skinny skin impressions had these weird ridged scales that hadn't been described in any other paper. So I scoured all the papers on Edmontosaurus skin. There was no mention of it anywhere. So we did describe it, and it was published in a paper very recently. But at the moment, we still don't know what it's from or why this specimen had different scales. So there's so many different possible ways that this could have occurred. One could be that it was just an age and growth thing. So younger animals maybe had different scales than older animals. Another thing is sexual dimorphism. So one sex might have had different scales than the other sex. And there's also localized scale variation. So maybe scales were different across the body, and we were just seeing the part of the body that we hadn't seen before. There's also potentially geographical variation. So these animals lived all the way down kind of the middle of the US all the way up to Saskatchewan. So maybe there were, localized populations that had slightly different scale patterns. And finally, this could maybe be a different species. Who knows? Hadrosaur, so duck-billed skin fossils, have been known to be different between two species. So this animal up here, Saurolophus, these are two species that are nearly identical based just on bones, but they have completely different scale patterns. So this is a question that we may never know, but it's one of those really fascinating things about paleontology from Saskatchewan. And there's currently still new developments since we published on the skin, and there's still ongoing research going on. So I actually got in contact with a paleontologist from the US, and he had mentioned that he had seen similar ridge scales from another specimen, but hadn't really thought anything of it and didn't publish on it or anything. And so he sent me some pictures, and you can see there are similar ridged scales on the specimen named Nancy. And this skin patch was actually from the hip region. So maybe this, pushes us toward the conclusion that the hip region had ridged scales for whatever reason. That's another mystery that we might never know. And then he actually sent me a few pictures from another specimen named Dakota, where there seemed to be some almost ridged scales on the forearm. So maybe ridged scales were more prevalent across the body. We just hadn't seen it until now. So these are some of the things that still need to be researched, but I think that's the fascinating part about paleontology, because you're always learning new things and finding these amazing mysteries. So that brings me to the end of the dinosaur skin section. And so now we're on to the final kind of project that I've been working on. And this is studying dinosaur age using what's called histology. So you may not know, but there are microscopic details that can be preserved in fossil bone. So in this case, all of those squiggly lines there, those are where the blood vessels would have ran through the bone. So this is a thin section of dinosaur bone, and all of these are blood vessels, and all of those little black spots there, that, when you zoom into it, is actually the areas or the pockets where the bone cells would have been around. So you can see this is a diagram of what's known as an osteon. No problem. And yeah, so you can see this right here is bone cells, or where the bone cells would have been. There's no bone cells left anymore. It's just an area that was left open, and it's been filled in by things like pyrite. But by using these microscopic details, we can study things like the age and growth of dinosaurs. So dinosaurs, when they grow, they preserve these growth rings, and these are pretty much like tree rings. And by counting them, you can start to estimate the age of dinosaurs. And this is commonly used on limb bone cross section. So take a limb bone, cut it in half, and make a slide with the thin section, and you can see some of these growth lines. So the dinosaur that I've been trying to work on is Thesliosaurus. So it's this I call it a very nondescript dinosaur because it's just a dinosaur. I don't know, there's not much cool or anything about it, but it is one of the most common herbivorous dinosaurs in Saskatchewan. And so there was actually a recently new species described from Saskatchewan. This one's called Thesliosaurus assiniboiensis, and the original specimen for that was about 2.5 meters long. But there's actually a species also from the US at the same time that was about 4 meters long, named Thesliosaurus neglectus. So we weren't sure if they were the same species, or we know they're different species, but we didn't know if Thesliosaurus assiniboiensis, so the Saskatchewan species, actually grew to match the size of the American species. So that was one of the questions I wanted to answer with my project. So, like I mentioned, things like the femur would be the best theoretically for this kind of study. So I looked at the Thesliosaur femora and didn't really find anything. And to clarify, to the right, that's a cross section going from the bottom, which is the inside of the bone, all the way to the edge of the bone of the femur. And then to the left, that's looking at the same bone, but under cross-polarized light. And so this allows us to differentiate between parallel fibered bone, so bone that's growing slowly, and more irregular fibered bone. So that's the woven bone at the bottom where it's red. That's when it was growing faster than where it is at the top where it's more green. So you can kind of see there's a layer of fast growth and then kind of a transition period and then slower growth. But this isn't very useful for age estimates. So what we tried is using ribs for age estimates. So this hasn't really been done too often before. People are starting to try it, but this was because people thought that ribs didn't preserve good growth rings. But a recent study has shown that you can really find pretty good growth rings, sometimes better than the femora, in ribs. And there's a few advantages to using ribs. So obviously there's more ribs than arm bones, so you're going to find more ribs. Therefore, they're more common. And since histology, you need to cut into the bone, it's a destructive technique, you want bones that you have more of if you want to sample. Also, it is a little bit less important for identifying species. So things like limb bones, you can use that to kind of narrow down what kind of species of dinosaur it is, but using ribs, they're pretty similar overall, so you can't really tell. So I sampled some of the ribs that we have of Thesliosaurus right at the head of the rib, so that's where growth would initiate. And we found growth rings. So these are some of the young specimens that I have. You can see there's two kind of faint lines. And once I highlight it, it might be a little bit more clear, but we think those are growth lines. And both of these specimens, preserve two growth rings. And we think that there's probably another one that's already been remodeled since it's been growing. So something kind of down in the medullary cavity here. So we estimate that these specimens were probably 3 years old. And if you look at some of the older specimens, you can see they have way more growth rings. So these both have 5 growth rings, but you can see this one on the left has growth rings all packed up to the edge of the bone. So we think that there's more growth rings that have been obscured. And if you look at the left one, it's really interesting because the middle of the bone is so porous. It looks like it almost had osteoporosis, which is common in older animals. So we think that this animal probably would have been 6 to 9 years old and maybe reaching kind of adulthood. But we don't really see a clear ending growth. So usually when you look at growth rings, old animals that have stopped growing have growth rings that are really packed at the edge of the bone. But in this case, it's a little bit packed, but not as much as you would expect. So we can't confidently say that these are fully grown adults. But based on what we have, we can start to reconstruct the life of a Thesliosaurus. So there was some early growth, and they reached probably up to 2 meters within the first couple of years. And then they probably reach sexual maturity. So this is when they become able to reproduce, and they start putting energy into reproduction more than growing. So you can see kind of a decline in the growth. And based on the largest specimens we have, we think that the lifespan might have been around 10 years, reaching estimated lengths of up to 4.5 meters. So like we kind of thought, the original specimen for the Saskatchewan species was not a fully grown animal, and fully grown animals probably reached the sizes of the American specimen or species. And another interesting that came up was that there might be another dinosaur in the mix of all of the Thessalsaurus specimens. So one of the femora that I sampled showed growth lines in it. So like I mentioned, there's no growth lines in any of the Thessalsaurus bones. This one has 3 growth lines. They're pretty faint, but some of them you can see pretty clearly. And so this might mean that it might belong to a different dinosaur, and we think it might belong to this small dome-headed dinosaur known as Spherothylus. So bones from this dinosaur are really rare. We haven't really found any, but apart from the domed head there, everything, the rest of the body is pretty similar to that of Thessalsaurus. So we think it might belong to this dinosaur here, and maybe histology gives us a way of distinguishing between these two very different species that have very similar bodies. So that brings me to the end of my talk. And if you don't take anything else, I want you to take home a couple things from this talk. One, that Saskatchewan is a very understudied and underrated hotspot for paleontological research. And I hope when you go out to the Badlands next time, you look around, you might find something really cool. And there's also, I just wanted to kind of share this fascination of how there's so much we've learned by using these new techniques, but there is so much left to learn about these amazing creatures. So that brings me to the end of my talk. Thanks to everyone for listening, and thanks to my supervisors and lab mates and everyone for helping out. And I can open up the floor to any questions if there are any.